On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley passed away at the age of 42.
Millions wept the day Elvis Presley was laid to rest. But some never believed the story was over. They pointed to a preacher named Bob Joyce, his voice, his smile, his soul-stirring gospel songs. And now, as Pastor Bob says, he's dying. He's ready to speak on the rumors that have haunted him for decades. Could it be true? Could the king of rock and roll still be alive among us? Millions remember the day the world stopped, August 16, 1977. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was declared dead at just 42. His funeral was rushed, the casket closed, and yet whispers never went silent. Fans swore they saw him in diners, at gas stations, even in small towns across America. But as years turned into decades, one name kept pulling the rumors back into the light: Pastor Bob Joyce. Standing 6 feet tall, with the same build, the same shoe size, and a voice that feels carved from the same southern soil, Pastor Bob doesn't just resemble Elvis, he is Elvis to those who still believe. His mannerisms are uncanny, the way he leans into a microphone, the way he scratches his left ear, even the warmth of his smile. And then there's the gospel. Elvis's first love wasn't rock, it was gospel. In Germany, long before Las Vegas, he turned to hymns for comfort. And Pastor Bob, his entire ministry revolves around gospel, pouring the same passion into every note. Some call it coincidence, others call it proof. And now with Pastor Bob whispering that he's dying, promising to reveal the truth about the Elvis rumors, the world is asking, did the king ever really leave the building, or has he been here all along, hiding in sight? To understand the weight of these rumors, you have to go back to Elvis's time in Germany. It was in 1958 when the king of rock and roll traded his microphone for a military uniform, serving with the U.S. Army in West Germany. Stationed in Friedberg, he lived in a quiet home at Goethestrasse 14 in Bad Nauheim. Far from Graceland, he surrounded himself with soldiers, locals, and music. It was there that he met Priscilla Beaulieu, just 14 at the time, the daughter of an Air Force officer. Their unlikely meeting would change both of their lives, though he kept much of his heart guarded. In Germany, Elvis leaned on gospel songs, hymns that gave him strength while the cameras waited for him back home. Gospel wasn't for the stage, it was for survival. Fast forward decades later, and in a small Arkansas church, Pastor Bob pours that same intensity into his sermons. When he sings, listeners say the echo of Elvis is undeniable. The voice that once electrified stadiums now fills a sanctuary. Coincidence or continuation? Skeptics argue there are millions of baritones in the world.
But believers hear more than tone. They hear the king's soul crying through every lyric. And then comes the habit, a tiny detail that no impersonator could fake. Physical likeness can be explained away, some say. But habits, those unconscious tics, are harder to dismiss. Elvis had a peculiar tell. He scratched his left ear during interviews, on stage, even in casual moments caught by cameras. It was never rehearsed, it was simply him. Now, Pastor Bob Joyce does the same. Mid-sermon, mid-song, his hand drifts to that same ear in that same rhythm. For fans, it feels less like coincidence and more like a fingerprint. And then there's the stature. Pastor Bob stands at 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the same athletic frame Elvis carried well into his 40s. Even the shoe size, an uncommon size 11, matches. To believers, every detail is another puzzle piece fitting perfectly into place. But the strongest evidence is not in bone structure or posture. It's in the sound. When Pastor Bob's deep southern drawl fills a church, it stops listeners cold. The timbre, the cadence, the way his voice lingers on certain vowels, it's uncanny. And when he sings gospel, the very genre Elvis turned to for comfort, it's as if decades have melted away. Skeptics roll their eyes. They say memory plays tricks. But even doubters admit the similarities are eerie. And just when people dismiss it as fantasy, Another clue emerges, one rooted not in sound or sight, but in timing. The timing is what unsettles people most. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead in August of 1977. His passing was said to be sudden, his funeral hurried, and the world mourned without clear answers. Then silence. But only 4 years later, just long enough for the noise to die down, a man named Bob Joyce quietly began his ministry in Arkansas. To believers, the gap is suspicious. 4 years was enough time for a global icon to disappear, recover from the storm of fame, and re-emerge with a new purpose, not as a rock star, but as a pastor. The timeline feels too neat, too carefully placed to be an accident. Even more haunting are the parallels in passion. Elvis often admitted that gospel was the music of his soul. He sang it in Germany while serving in the army. He recorded it even at the peak of his fame. It was his refuge when the world became too heavy. And now Pastor Bob devotes his entire life to gospel, pouring emotion into hymns that sound like echoes from Graceland. Skeptics say this is just romantic storytelling, a desperate way for fans to keep their idol alive. But for those who listen closely, the overlap in dates, in music, and in spirit feels like a hidden confession written in time itself. The voice. That's where the whispers grow loudest. Elvis Presley's voice was unmistakable, rich, deep, with a southern drawl that carried both fire and sorrow. It wasn't just singing, it was storytelling, wrapped in velvet and thunder. Decades later, Pastor Bob Joyce opens his mouth and the room falls silent. The same resonance, the same depth, the same lingering vowels. Listeners describe it as chilling, like stepping back into a memory that refuses to fade. When Pastor Bob sings gospel, the resemblance becomes uncanny. These aren't random songs. Many are the very hymns Elvis cherished. How Great Thou Art, Amazing Grace. Each note carries the same intensity that once electrified stadiums, now channeled into a small-town church. For longtime fans, it feels less like coincidence and more like a continuation, a voice refusing to be buried. Skeptics argue that voices can be similar, that memory tricks the ear. But believers counter with a simple truth. This isn't just about sound, it's about emotion. Pastor Bob sings with the same conviction Elvis once poured into gospel, raw, unpolished, heartfelt. It's not mimicry, it's identity. And just when critics dismiss the voice as a happy accident, another detail rises, one so personal, so private, that it shakes the line between coincidence and confession. A smile can hide secrets, but it can also reveal them. Elvis Presley's grin was legendary, warm, magnetic, and carefully polished for Hollywood. Yet behind that famous smile was a quiet insecurity. Early photos showed a small gap in his teeth that was later closed with dental work as his career demanded perfection. To most, it was a forgotten detail, erased by fame. But believers noticed something striking. Pastor Bob Joyce's smile bears the same curve, the same faint trace of that old dental history. To conspiracy theorists, this isn't just resemblance, it's evidence. They argue that no impersonator could mimic something as specific as dental work, especially decades after the king's supposed death. Even in casual photos, the resemblance feels eerie, as though time folded in on itself and carried that same grin into the present. Skeptics, of course, dismiss it. They say people see what they want to see, that when grief lingers long enough, the mind projects old memories onto new faces. But fans insist this isn't imagination. They believe the smile connects the dots. The same warmth, the same flash of charisma, the same hint of the man who once defined an era. And yet, the smile is just one clue. The true weight of the mystery lies not in looks or teeth, but in the aura that surrounds him.
Charisma cannot be forged. It is either there or it isn't. Elvis had it in spades. On stage, he didn't just sing, he commanded the atmosphere. Fans spoke of feeling pulled into something greater than themselves. as though his presence alone created a current of energy. Now, decades later, worshippers sitting in Pastor Bob Joyce's pews describe something eerily familiar. They talk of the way he moves his hands when he preaches, the way he leans forward as though sharing a secret with the room. His laughter, warm, sudden, unpretentious, carries the same rhythm Elvis once used to disarm interviewers. Even his pauses in speech mirror the king's style, deliberate yet inviting, as if every word is weighed before it leaves his lips. But it's more than gestures. It's the way he makes people feel. Congregants say there's a magnetic pull when he speaks, a sense of being seen, as though he brings everyone into his orbit. For Elvis fans, that aura is unmistakable. To them, it's as though the king never truly left. He simply traded stadium lights for stained glass windows. Skeptics call it projection. Believers call it revelation. And as if charisma weren't enough, the timeline of Elvis's supposed death adds even more fuel to the fire, because the story of August 1977 was filled with loose ends. The official story says Elvis Presley died in Memphis on August 16, 1977. Heart failure. A nation in shock. But the details surrounding that day have always been clouded in suspicion. Witnesses disagreed on what exactly happened. His funeral was arranged at breakneck speed. The casket closed before most could see him, and his face, according to those who did, looked strangely altered, almost wax-like. Fans whispered that it wasn't Elvis in that coffin at all. Then came the sightings. At airports, in diners, even rumored appearances at concerts. Newspapers dismissed them as fantasy, but each sighting carried the same theme. A man who looked, walked, and sounded like Elvis, just older, quieter, and determined to stay in the shadows. Now add Pastor Bob Joyce to the equation. His ministry began in 1981, only 4 years after the supposed death. To believers, the timing is too perfect to ignore. They argue Elvis staged his exit, tired of fame's golden cage, and re-emerged as a preacher, free at last from the crushing weight of stardom. Skeptics, however, point to hard evidence, birth certificates, medical records, eyewitness testimonies. To them, the king is gone, and Pastor Bob is just an uncanny look-alike. But the unanswered questions from 1977 still leave cracks wide enough for belief to slip through. Strip away the fame, the scandals, the glitter of Las Vegas, and one truth about Elvis Presley always remained. Gospel was his refuge. Long before Jailhouse Rock or Hound Dog, he sat at a piano in Memphis singing hymns with his mother. Even at the height of his career, he returned to gospel again and again, recording albums that revealed his true heart. Now, decades later, Pastor Bob Joyce stands at the front of a small-town church, pouring his soul into those very same songs. Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art. Listeners describe it as a time machine. The notes feel alive, the emotion raw, as if the spirit of Elvis himself is carried in every lyric. To believers, this is no coincidence. They see it as the strongest thread linking two lives into one story. Critics brush it off. They argue thousands of pastors love gospel, thousands of voices echo similar melodies. But fans insist there is something different here. They don't just hear music, they feel the same shiver they once felt when Elvis closed his eyes and let the gospel move through him. And if gospel really was his first love, then what better hiding place than in plain sight, leading a life centered around faith and the very songs that defined his soul? For all the whispers, Pastor Bob Joyce has been clear. He denies being Elvis Presley. To him, the rumors are a distraction from his ministry. Records show Pastor Bob was born in 1952, making him 17 years younger than Elvis. Skeptics point to this as undeniable proof that the two men cannot be the same person. The numbers don't lie, they argue. Case closed. But believers aren't convinced. They suggest records can be altered, identities hidden, and official stories rewritten. To them, Pastor Bob's denials are simply part of the cover, protecting a man who chose peace over fame. After all, they ask, if Elvis really did fake his death, would he ever admit it outright? What makes the theory endure isn't just the looks, the voice, or even the gospel. It's the aura, the sense that Elvis's spirit, or perhaps Elvis himself, still walks among us. Fans who sit in Pastor Bob's church describe it as more than a resemblance. They say it feels like a reunion. The truth remains locked between faith and fantasy, between documents and devotion. And now, as Pastor Bob whispers that he's dying, he promises to finally reveal everything about the Elvis rumors.